And we're back. You're listening to the Talkin' Boxing with Billy C show. Glad you could join us. Give a shout out to my Fox Sports radio listeners, WMML 1230. Glad you guys could join us. Don't forget about our website, www.billycboxing.com. Now, every week we do a segment, well, it's called
Blast from the Past. We shine the spotlight again on fighters from years past.
Top-ranking Joe Louis is the leading contender.
Joe Frazier with a left hook. Good right hand thrown by Foreman that time. Look at that left hook. Belt that goes to Ray Mancini.
It's Blast from the Past on Talkin' Boxing.
And this week's Blast from the Past, which is being sponsored by KOFantasyBoxing.com. Check it out, www.kofantasyboxing.com. Features a former world champion and boxing Hall of Famer who fought a long time ago. His name, Young Griffo. Now joining me to tell us all about Young Griffo, even when he got old, is my man, Alex Pierpaoli. What's up, brother?
Good evening, Billy. How are you?
Great. This guy's right up your alley, man. Tell us about Young Griffo.
Young Griffo. His real name was Albert Griffiths. He was born April 15th, 1869 in, I think I'm saying this right, Sofala, New South Wales, Australia. And there's actually some dispute. It could have been Miller's Point was another name for it that I saw mentioned, but April 15th, 1869, so quite a long time ago.
Yeah, right after the Civil War, right?
Yeah. Civil War was, 1863 to 65?
65, yeah.
And in Australia, and he fought in Australia for quite a while, had an incredible amount of fights. He was only 5'4", and he fought at featherweight and a little bit at lightweight as well. But he was another one of these newspaper boys. We run into a lot of these really, really tough newspaper boys.
I know those guys. You finally brought that to light a couple of blasts ago. You're like, man, these newspaper kids really had a rough time of it. You think they're selling newspapers? How rough can it be? It was bad, right? I mean,
they must have. They were fighting for each other's turf. They wanted to deliver the papers. Everybody had their own, radius of blocks that they must have covered. So I guess that's where he started fighting, and then was an amateur for a while. But this was a guy who he was incredibly defensive. One of the ways I saw him described on Cyber Boxing Zone is a rat-tat-tat artist. I like that. He wasn't a big puncher, but he was very, very clever. And this guy. Some people kind of refer to him as perhaps one of the cleverest boxers in the game ever. He had this incredibly, it seemed to be an innate, natural ability to dodge punches. There was a story that they insisted was true. One of his probably his downfall, you'd have to say, was that he was allergic to alcohol, and was addicted. And he probably never trained to his full capacity, and would go on periods where he'd stay off the drink, and then he'd be back on the drink. But one of the things he used to do, one of his tricks, was that he would take a handkerchief out and put it on the floor of a saloon, and bet that you could not, he would stand on it, and I would assume he would be standing with his feet shoulder-width apart, just on the square of cloth, and you could not hit him, you could not get him off that square of handkerchief, and he, would always win. Another thing that he would do is similar, where he would put the handkerchief down, standing in front of a mirror, and then he would watch the reflection, and he would bet that you couldn't hit him. And he just was able to, make people miss just with head movement. In the ring, he was an incredible master of feints, and just really a very, very clever defensive fighter.
This guy, there's no surprise that we picked him, because we're talking a lot about the big fight of our generation, or one of the biggest fights of our generation now, coming up in May between Pacquiao and Mayweather. And one of the things that people talk about with Mayweather is how great of a defensive fighter he is. But a point that I made earlier in the week, or maybe it was the end of last week, I don't know. Well, everything runs together to me. But, the difference with Floyd is he's a defensive master, but he uses his feet to get himself out of trouble. And I used Rigondeaux as an example of a guy who is great defensively but uses his upper body and his head. And lo and behold, we got young Griffo, who doesn't even move his feet, and he's got the the head movement and the body movement that was so dazzling that nobody could even hit him. And you're right. This was a guy that was not known for power, was known for having incredible boxing skill, great defense, but he never trained. You mentioned that he liked to drink, but this guy just didn't train, and it makes you wonder how great of this fighter. He's a Hall of Famer now. How great of a fighter he could have been if he trained. The thing I wanted to just say real quick is that I can't help but love the names of some of these opponents that he fought. Now, you're right. He fought most of his career early on in Australia. As a matter of fact, from 1894 until 1904, the last decade of his career, that's when I start to notice names that are familiar to me. But prior to that, some of the names that I just love, and he fought these guys many, many times. Young Pluto, Torpedo Billy Murphy, Midnight Godfrey, Richard Deerfoot Rose, Maurice Dummy Winters. I mean, you can't make these names up, I wish that they had the nicknames today like they used to use back in the day, man.
And definitely, those you got to figure. Those are all Australian tough guys. That's like reading the credits of extras in the Mad Max films. Yeah, I like some of those. What was one of them I thought I saw was Nippy Peaks. Where was that one? Yeah, there's a lot of great names. Torpedo Billy Murphy, that is a good one.
Yeah, he fought him.
Smith. Well, that one was actually in Chicago.
He fought Torpedo Billy Murphy a couple of times. How about along the lines of early in his career, you have a win, a 4-round win against unknown boxer, An
unknown, unnamed opponent.
Unknown.
Chiddy Ryan, Chiddy, Chiddy. He must have fought him about 12 times.
I know. And then when in 1894, then you start seeing names that we recognize: Solly Smith, Kid Levine, George Dixon a few times. He fought him a bunch of times. Jack McAuliffe, another great Australian fighter, fought him a bunch of times. Joe Gans, of course, Frank Ern, Charlie McKeever. I mean, these are names that we know. Young Peter Jackson. I mean, these are names we know, but those great nicknames back in the day, they were great, man. I love that.
Oh yeah, and he did. He fought from 1886 to 1894. I didn't count them up, but he must be like 20 fights a year in Australia. And that is where he does repeat. Yeah, Nipper Peaks is one of the guys. I like that name. But yeah, in 1894, he came over to the United States on the Alameda, was the name of the ship. And that's when he started fighting here, like you mentioned, some of the recognizable names. And these guys spoke really highly of him. Kid Levine spoke very highly of him after fighting him. And that it was that fight, Jack McAuliffe, that gave McAuliffe his. They thought of McAuliffe as the champion after that. I thought I saw that, but it doesn't say that.
Well, that was it was a controversial loss. So a lot of people felt that young Griffo won that fight when they awarded him that. And rumor also had it that he would come to the ring either drunk or severely hungover. I mean, how do you avoid all these punches as a defensive genius when you're drunk or hungover? I mean, it makes you wonder about this guy if he would have been serious. Yeah,
it really does make you wonder about that. And that's one of the things they mention is that physically he looked more like the build of a slugger, but he was so elusive. He was definitely more of a stylist. A guy who you just couldn't lay your hands on, and there was a couple of fights where he came to he was woken up just out of a stupor just a couple of hours before going to the ring to fight. And yeah, you could only say that there's some sort of natural talent that a person has. He really found the thing he was good at in fighting. And he, I don't know, I guess James Toney would be maybe a modern corollary of a guy who's similar in that he's incredibly elusive. He could stand right in front of you and you can't hit him. He's cocky as hell. And he doesn't train, he's never trained up to the peak of his ability, of what you believe he could do. I think maybe that's sort of like somebody today that somebody would maybe compare to like a modern day young Griffo. But he did, like you mentioned, the fights with George Dixon were really big fights, and that was where he crossed the color line. George Dixon, of course, a great African-American fighter, and I think he's Canadian, wasn't he? But black fighter. And then he had the first of 3 fights with Joe Gans, and that first one, Colleen Aycock and Mark Scott mentioned it in their book. He suggested that it was rigged in favor of Gans, but it ended up being a newspaper draw, and that was one of the things that, a lot of those fights, of course, were the newspaper decisions at that time.
Yeah, that's so strange, those newspaper decisions. But the thing about him though, and you mentioned James Toney, but James Toney, he took, yes, he had a great defense, but he did take a lot of shots too. I mean, people did land punches on James's body, and it seems like people couldn't even touch this guy at all. And the other thing about him was that he had extremely fast hands. They referred to him as a very rapid two-hand attacking type fighter, which makes you wonder why he didn't have as many knockouts. And you're right, when he won the world title, it was in 1890 against Torpedo Murphy there, Torpedo Billy Murphy, when he beat him, and that was one of his rare stoppages. Torpedo Billy Murphy in Sydney, Australia, couldn't continue. That's when he won the world title. But when he lost it, I can't seem to see where he lost it.
To Jack McAuliffe.
Okay. That was the controversial fight following that. Okay, that makes sense. So all those other fights, you see, that was what they did. They didn't have title defenses. So that Jack McAuliffe fight didn't come for several years after that.
Yeah, and I wonder how this was definitely his prime, I would say, because you don't see stories, because this guy really had a pretty turbulent lifestyle outside of the ring. And there's an article by Mike Casey that's really good that mentions it, how it's the lifestyle of the drunk. You're always, you're living hard, and you're always making a lot of friends and then breaking promises and apologizing for things. And he went through managers like crazy. So I wonder if those problems hadn't, because that does explain some of the gaps in his career. But I think at that point, after McAuliffe and stuff, that was definitely his prime. Because if you look, it's pretty steady. He's in the ring, active. But then as it keeps going, it's less and less. And that was where there was more and more arrests, and there's a lot of articles about, a former manager is in court with him for stealing a jacket. I found one of the articles. Then there's another one he's picked up for vagrancy. So it was unfortunate that the drink really was the peril of his life.
Yeah, and you loved every article you read about that, I'm sure. And 4 years after he won that title, he ended up losing to McAuliffe in the controversial decision in the States. And it seems that he got into more issues in the United States after he came over here in terms of, sinking deeper into the abyss. I mean, living on the streets and all of that stuff, and like you said, the alcoholism and stuff. And it didn't... He was a wise guy, too, when he was a little buzzed, too, from what a lot of the reports say.
Yeah, he did, and I thought I put a note next to it, but I'm trying to find where I wrote it down. He did have, I think it was with Kid Levine, he had like some extracurricular activities outside of the ring, where he almost got into a fight at a bar with him.
Well,
yeah, there was a lot of troubles like that. But they did. They thought of him as one of the greatest natural boxer in the world. At times, they called him. So it really is one of those stories of what could have been.
Well,
but he did have the first fight with Joe Gans ended in a draw. The second fight with Joe Gans was also a 15-round draw. And in that one, and also this was the case with Dixon too. They were newspaper decisions. But the third time he met Joe Gans was too much for him, and by that time there was a little bit more of a slowness to him, and the years were taken, and his lifestyle was taking a toll on him. And Gans did stop him in eight rounds of a bloody fight.
When he started his career in 1886, he went pretty much 12 years straight, nonstop, fighting a lot, all the way until 1898. That's when the break started. His last good fight, he had that annihilation over young Peter Jackson in 1898, and he followed that by a 20-round win over Joseph DeWitt. And then he was out of the ring for a couple of years, and then you start to see that kind of decline where you mentioned where he fights, and then he only fought a couple of times in 1900, and ultimately his last fight in 1904. Now, I know that he ended up pretty destitute, but I wasn't able to find anything that he did consistently as a job. I mean, from 1904, they say in retirement, by 1911, he was already, panhandling. I guess that he didn't make that much money, or at least didn't hold on to it. Did he have any job after he hung him up in 1904, or what did you find out?
I don't think so. I think he had burnt through most of his money. This from the Mike Casey article. George Dawson, one of his managers, was utterly exasperated. He told friends that giving money to Griffo was akin to throwing it in the sewer. John Whitbeck scathingly remarked, "Young Griffo is a degenerate of the worst type. It is absolutely impossible to keep him in respectable condition. Given $500 tonight, he will be broke tomorrow, and no inducement, not even the guarantee of $10,000 for 20 minutes works with the gloves, would make him forego a drinking bout." So, yeah, he couldn't, he couldn't complete any sort of, like if somebody said, "Hey, come on, and I'll pay you to put on an exhibition or something," he couldn't even be guaranteed to show up the next day. So
in other words,
pretty bad.
So in other words, if you had a pint of beer, you could probably get him to do pretty much anything, huh?
Maybe, yeah. And that is the sad thing, is that it does seem that he, like some other fighters we've had, I forget who it was in the past, a couple, was it Adwalgas maybe, who sort of had that Blanche Dubois finish there, where he had to rely on the courtesy of strangers. This young Griffo had a home in Mrs. Rose Collins. He had an apartment, a one-room apartment in her rental house, and he would go down the street. I guess this is in Manhattan. He would go down the street to the Rialto Theater in Broadway. He couldn't read, but he would get the paper every day. He knew lots of people. I mean, he had lots of friends. I mean, that's kind of typical with drunks, I mean, if you know that side of them, the Dr. Jekyll side, you're friendly with them. It's the Mr. Hyde side that, that's the sad part that ends up dying alone in a one-room apartment. He had one suit of clothes. He would walk down the block every morning and sit in front of the Rialto Theater, or every evening, rather, sit in front of the Rialto Theater, greet everyone as they would come out, and people for a while would recognize him. And then he would get the papers. He would look at the pictures. They said he was illiterate, so they didn't really know why he got the papers. It was just tradition. He wanted to look as if he was respectable there. And One night he came home and banged on Mrs. Rose Collins' door and was grabbing his throat, said he couldn't breathe, and he was dead of apoplexy, which I guess, I don't know, I guess that's, I meant to look that up. I've heard that expression before. I'm not sure what that is exactly, but...
God,
the
funeral,
he was buried in a plot paid for by Tex Rickard.
Yeah. Ironic, the guy starts out selling newspapers and he can't read, and he ends his life getting newspapers every day and looks at the pictures.
Yeah.
Another interesting fact about young Griffo.
Yeah, I guess it's a cerebral hemorrhage or a stroke, apoplexy.
Well, at least for a minute there, I thought maybe Mrs. Rose gave him a piece of apple pie or something. But but an interesting thing, 1886, when he started boxing, he was still boxing under the old, not the Marquis boxing rules, the London prize ring rules in 1886, which I find interesting because a lot of the guys that we talk about are under the modern rules.
I think some of his bouts were bare knuckle.
Yeah, the London prize ring rules in 1886 was when he started. They were still following those. So,
and that's something I wonder if that was a big change that happened over in Australia, because that was one of the things that in Mark and Colleen's book they mention, is that's one of the reasons why he came over here, because it was getting harder to make a living in Australia, because I guess there had been some very publicized ring deaths, and boxing wasn't getting the purses that he was used to. So that was part of the reasons why he came over here.
And the beer was cheaper too, we heard.
Could be, yeah.
An interesting thing, his nickname was the Australian Will-O-Wisp. And this was
Will-O-Wisp.
But this was 40, 50 years before the Will-O-Wisp that we know.
Well, isn't it? It's a I think it's is it a figure from mythology or something? Will-O-the-Wisp. I forget, because there was a Marvel Comics Spider-Man fought the Will-O-the-Wisp. Billy C.
Oh, okay. Well, you would know that. I'm thinking boxing, man. I'm like, wait a minute, man. That's. But who'd you put him against, man?
So I put him against the two top guys at featherweight at BillyCBoxing.com. I put him in against the number one is Johnny Gonzalez, and the first time they fought, and this is one of those things where I think just the sheer quantity of fights, because he's got an incredible amount of bouts that were in Australia. So when you put a prime young Griffo in there, that's a lot of fights. Prime top condition compared to a guy like Johnny Gonzalez, prime top condition. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the inside workings of how the program works, but you got to figure that the just sheer quantity of wins that he has and bouts that he has, that level of experience must do something. So he did beat Gonzalez. It was a close fight. Griffo lost points. It was a little rough. It was a close fight. Split decision, 114-112, two times for Griffo. One judge had it the same score, but for Gonzalez, Griffo lost points in the 11th and 12th for holding and hitting. Referee was Kenny Bayless. It's randomly assigned. It's all kinds of refs are in there. And he started warning Griffo for holding and hitting in the first, and actually took a point, like I said, in the 11th and 12th, and then warned him again in the fourth for rabbit punching. So it was kind of a rough fight. When I put him in there 100 times, young Griffo gets the better of him. 85 wins for Griffo. He lost 9 times. They had 6 draws. Griffo knocked Gonzalez out 22 times. And of Gonzalez's 9 wins, he was able to stop young Griffo 5 times. Then against Nicholas Walters, who's ranked number 2 at BillyCBoxing.com, Griffo beat him by split decision as well. And these are 12-rounders, by the way. 116-112 and 115-113 for Griffo, and another judge had it 115-113 the other way in favor of Walters. And again, Nicholas Walters in this fight, it was he was getting warned for low blows, and he was the one who was very frustrated. But it was a close fight. Over 100 bouts, Griffo dominates him as well. 81 wins, 15 wins for Nicholas Walters, 4 draws, Griffo was able to knock Nicholas Walters out 12 times, and of Nicholas Walters' 15 wins, he did stop young Griffo 2 times.
Sometimes I wonder about the game because, young Griffo, I could see other fighters getting frustrated with him because they couldn't hit him, but he wasn't known as a dirty fighter, and he certainly wasn't stopped. I mean, of his whole career, he was only stopped 4 times, and that was, 2 of them were in the last couple of fights of his career. Actually, all of them were in the last from that 1900 on, so, and they say that he had slowed down considerably, from the effects, not so much in the ring because he didn't take beatings, but from the booze, so interesting,
yeah.
Interesting how they do that. But it seems like they have the right guy. You look at the rankings, and just to get off of young Griffo for a second, you look at the rankings in the featherweight division on Billy C Boxing, and what amazes me is you see Johnny Gonzalez number 1, Walters number 2, Donaire, and so on. Gary Russell's ranked at number 10. He's getting the shot at the world title holder at number 1. That's the way the sport is today. You get a guy that's number 10 or even rated lower than that, and they're getting shots rather than have that number 1 guy fighting the number 2 guy, and for a shot at the title. And the reason is because they kind of all have titles. There's so many titles that, you're looking at legitimate top 5, 6 guys, and they are all champions. So, when the champions are making defenses, they're fighting against guys that technically shouldn't even be ranked in the top 10.
Right, yeah. But they're really more like 11th, 12th, or 13th.
Right, but anyway, young Griffo, career record, 68 wins, 33 coming by knockout. He had 11 losses in which he was only stopped 4 times. He had 38 draws. Now, that's on the decision bouts. He fought a lot of his fights, 20-round decisions and stuff. Now, he did fight 54 newspaper bouts, 50 wins, 1 loss, and 3 draws. He had on record that they recorded anyway, 229 bouts. Like Alex said, 5'4", 68-inch reach, 1,561 rounds as a pro with only a 15% knockout ratio. He died pretty young at 58 years old in 1927. Young Griffo, our blast from the past today. He was a former world featherweight champion, and he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1991. Great job as usual on that, Alex.
Thank you.